It's a pleasure to be here in the Natural History Museum, which is, of course, a treasure for the University of Iowa. And thanks to everybody who came, friends, family, students, et cetera. And so I'm going to tell you about the ongoing work in my lab, which is about sex, of course. And so I changed my title. So the title that I had on the flyer was It's Sometimes Strange Evolutionary History, but of course it seemed, in retrospect, a little bit more appropriate to call it natural history, which are basically the same thing. Natural history is indeed evolutionary history, and as an evolutionary biologist, I thought I would point that out. So this is a snapshot of the people in my lab and a guest, and you can go take your picture with our guest. This is about a year ago, so it doesn't need a lot of updating. There's a couple of new people, and there's some people that have departed, but for the most part, this is the assembled cast of players that have contributed to the work, including some people in the audience, and the person who ran my lab while I was on sabbatical, Cindy Brochu, who's in the audience. So she deserves a lot of credit, and lots of other people in the lab have contributed to the work that I'll tell you about. And this lists all those people, including people that are current, and a lot of the work that I'll present came from a former graduate student in my lab, Banu Malik, who's gone on to do postdoctoral work in a couple of different places, and she's doing very well. But the work I'll present is very much a group effort, and a lot of people have contributed, from postdocs, graduate students, lab technicians, undergraduates, even some high school students have contributed to some of the work that I'll tell you about. The money is important because the work that we do isn't cheap in some ways, and we get support from the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, and our local agency, the Carver Trust. And of course, you all have contributed to the NIH and NSF funds indirectly in terms of your tax dollars, so I appreciate that. So I have some great colleagues who have collaborated with, including Bob Malone at the University of Iowa and Maureen Neiman, who's in the audience. I won't talk about our work with Maureen. And a lot of the work that we do is based on work that's existing out in the world, which are genome sequences. So in the last 10 years or so, there's been a lot of effort put forth in sequencing genomes of organisms. And I've been able to, and people in my lab have been able to use those data quite effectively. And so I have to thank at least some of the pioneers that got this thing rolling. And nowadays, genomes are a dime a dozen, but 10 years ago, they were actually quite important, and people that pioneered those, including Mitch Sogan, et cetera. And then finally, I have to, and at the end of my talk, I'll talk about this group of organisms that we're working on called rotifers, and my main collaborator is this guy, David Mark Welch, at Woods Hole, that has been important in this work. So let's talk about sex. I didn't time the music very well, apparently. So what is sex? Why do it? For other than the obvious reasons. And in particular, when and how did sex evolve? It's not obvious that this ought to be the case in biology. So we want to understand the evolutionary history, the natural history, and of course the underpinnings, sort of the molecular underpinnings of sex. And if we were able to, we might be able to answer this question. All right. So sex really is really sort of two halves of an equation. I call it the yin and yang of sex. And what we usually talk about when we're talking about sex is the getting together of gametes. Okay, so gametes are haploid, meaning they have half of the genetic material of all of us sitting out in the audience. We all have diploid, 2 copies of every chromosome. Okay, but we can all make gametes that are haploid, and those haploid gametes get together by fusion. And that's what we usually think about as sex, or the process that leads to the bringing together of those gametes. But the other side of the equation is that process that generates those gametes. And it's a complex molecular process, genetic process called meiosis, that takes those diploid cells, which we all have, specialized in our germline, the part of our organism that creates those gametes, that are diploid, and halves them via this process of meiosis. And what I'm going to tell you about, which you might actually doubt is very sexy, but okay, is this process of meiosis and how it evolves as a way of understanding the evolution of sex. Okay? So what about sex? So the natural history of sex is interesting because it's quite variable. We generally think about sexual life cycles. Since we're humans, we think about our own sexual life cycles. And so we have a sexual life cycle in which we spend our lives as individuals as diploids, and we generate through meiosis haploid gametes, which have a very sort of, at least for men, have a very short lifetime, and they get together, and they don't make organisms themselves, but they get together and they fuse and they make a zygote and then make a new organism. Okay. In females, those gametes are actually sitting in meiosis at birth for mammals and persist for a long time. But anyway, so the main individual is this diploid individual, and it makes gametes. So we're used to thinking about this kind of sexual life cycle. But lots of organisms don't do it the way we do it. They do the opposite, which is to say that their body, if you will, are haploid. Right? They spend most of their time as haploid individuals, and then fuse. Those haploid individuals find each other and fuse and make a zygote, make a diploid individual, and then it immediately goes through meiosis and make another haploid individual, and that haploid individual persists as the sort of vegetative state. Okay. Some organisms actually can't decide, and they do a little bit of both. So like hornworts, shown here. So this was a fungus back here, but lots of different organisms do. So some organisms actually spend part of their bodies doing both haploid and diploid. So there's a lot of variation in terms of what parts of the body are diploid and haploid. Okay. So the asexual or growth phase, we think about asexuality as being the growth phase. Like in a real sense, our skin cells are asexual. They're just growing mitotically. Okay. They can be haploid or diploid or both. Okay. The other thing about sex is that we tend to think about gametes as being this sort of distinct thing, but in many organisms they're actually pretty much the same thing. They can be similar. They might have mating types such that there might be plus and minus, or there might be more complexity than this, but we call this isogamy, where you can't really tell the boys from the girls, as it were. Okay. We tend to think about this, which we call anisogamy, where gametes are different in some way or another. In particular, we tend to think of the big gametes as being eggs and the small gametes as being sperm, and that leads to the kind of thinking about the evolution of the sexes, which of course has happened actually many times in evolution, at least a few times, that we've had generation of multicellular organisms that make big gametes and small gametes, which we call egg and sperm, which have different roles in evolution. And so generally we think about males as having small, mini gametes, and their only function, really, sorry guys, our main function is fertilization. And females have big gametes, make relatively few of them, and their function is both fertilization and provision of nutrition for that early zygote. And it leads to this sort of idea, which is based in a lot of data, which is that in general, sperm is cheap and eggs are expensive, and that sets up issues in evolution about male and female, sort of a different kind of investments, okay, that sometimes happen in different kinds of organisms where this part of sex actually drives differences between the sexes in many ways. I'm not going to talk much about that. We can talk about it at the end if you want. What's next? Oh, yeah. So sex is really the rule. Even though there's all these differences amongst organisms, really sexual reproduction among organisms that we're going to talk about from here on, which are eukaryotic organisms that have nuclear, they have their genomes separated in a separate compartment called nucleus. It's the rule. Everybody's doing it for the most part. Some organisms need some help. And anyway, but it's widespread. Animals, plants, fungi, single-celled organisms like protists. There's some strange things like organisms that are hermaphrodites. It's actually not that strange in biology. We just think it might be strange, and et cetera. So there's lots of variation, but really sex is the rule. But sex being the rule, however, asexuality, the ability to make a clone of oneself among organisms, is actually quite a common feature amongst many organisms. Animals do it, lots of different animals, including even vertebrate animals, plants, fungi, protozoa, single-celled organisms, and this set of organisms, which I'll talk about at the end, which are rotifers, which are small microscopic animals, but they're actually thought to be the exemplar group in which sex is actually not known. So these organisms may have actually figured out how to live without sex. Okay, so they're all females. They only make babies by cloning themselves. They make daughters that are identical. I thought I'd mention just briefly here, you might be saying, okay, well, what about prokaryotes? So I was saying that really this talk is about eukaryotes, those cells with nuclei in them. Prokaryotes, bacteria, in fact, are asexual. Okay, but their genomes are set up in a very different way. They actually carry out a sort of sex in a different way. They actually exchange DNA sort of one gene at a time. When we're talking about sex, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in a minute, eukaryotic sex is about exchanging whole genomes worth of DNA. Okay, so meiosis, the process that I'm going to tell you about, is actually exchanging whole genomes worth of DNA. And so it's that innovation, that sort of complicated and a little bit confusing innovation that we're interested in its evolutionary history. So why sex? What's it good for? Okay. Another way of saying that in a scientific way, perhaps, is what is the adaptive significance, okay, of sex? There are probably many costs and risks that you can think of that are associated with sexual reproduction. So does anybody have any, this is where my teaching moment comes in, does anybody have any ideas about what might be a cost? Got some smart undergraduates in here, I think. What might be a cost of sex? Don't think about the good parts, just think about what might be the problems associated with it. Anybody? Yeah.
Diseases.
Diseases, that's a good one. It's on my list, it's going to show up. Any other good ideas? Is it easy? Oh, Cindy's got an idea.
You have to find a partner.
You got to find a mate, right? A partner. It's not always easy, right? Match.com is out there for a reason. All right. Any others? All right. Searching for a mate, time and energy, and a good computer sometimes. That mate actually might require some investment, right? Sure, you love each other, but is your credit compatible? Risk of sexually transmitted diseases? Not without risk. And a fun one, which is that, you know, sex in and of itself is not always safe, depending on what kind of organism you are. You might be familiar with the case of the praying mantis, and so this is a female praying mantis, and this male praying mantis is sneaking up on her and attempting to mate with her, because if he doesn't sneak up just right, she's going to bite his head off, literally, and eat it. And, you know, he'll continue actually mating with her even with his head gone, but that will assure his paternity in the future. So sex isn't entirely without cost. So why do it, right? Like I said, asexual reproduction is actually pretty widespread across eukaryotes. So why have an organism just given this up altogether? Well, a very famous evolutionary biologist, probably the most important evolutionary biologist of our generation, of the last century, John Maynard Smith, spent a lot of time talking about this and thinking about it and writing about it. And he asked, you know, in populations that can do both, why in the heck are they doing sex, right? Because asexuality is much easier. And in fact, it's not only easier, it's obviously easier, because in a sexual population, at every generation, the mother actually, in producing male offspring, is reducing her output, right? So by combining her genes with another organism, she's halving her genetic contribution and reducing her own contribution to the next generation. In an asexual population, the mom can make, this mom's making two organisms, one of which is a male. He's not good for much of anything. But here she can make two daughters that are identical copies of herself.